Well, very many thanks, and thank you to everybody for coming back. I must admit, when I saw Michael Marshall's talk earlier, I thought, boy, that a tough act to follow, and I was sure you'd all go to the panel that he's on now, so thank you very much for reappearing. It's also great this morning, especially given one of the topics of the panel this afternoon, to see so many women in the audience. That really is refreshing, especially given the sector that I've spent a fair bit of my career on, in terms of numbers of scientists and engineers who are women who actually choose to work in it. So I'm going to talk to you this morning about the challenge to get enough electricity to keep our homes going and our industry going 24/7, 365 days a year, and to talk about the climate change targets and what sort of challenge that's given us in terms of whether we can meet them or not. And hopefully I'll be able to convince you that we still need a significant contribution from nuclear energy in order to both deliver strong, viable electricity network and also to meet the climate change targets. So, oops, is this supposed to be ticking along? Yep, there we go. This is Manchester on an average day, except we normally have umbrellas up in Manchester on an average day, so this is obviously a fine day like today. Electricity is used to power an awful lot of what we do, whether it be moving around on the trams, getting treated in one of Manchester Trust's hospitals, cooking, or sort of Skyping or emailing with our grandparents in terms of what we've been up to during the day. So a vital commodity to keep us going as far as our daily life's concerned. So it's fine here in Manchester, but when you look at what happens globally, this is a family in India who are a really lucky family because they've actually got electricity in their home and they've got a tiny telly to watch and lights that sporadically come on when they haven't got power cuts. But the world is not an even place, so that's their lot, if they're lucky. And this is our lot if we're just doing our normal daily things with our latest flat screen TV or curved screen TV, if we're lucky, and everything else that goes with living in the 21st century. So big disparity between those who have and those who have not in the energy sense, as well as the food, the water, the financial sense. And when we look at what happens in terms of population of the Earth, we're seeing ever-increasing numbers, projected to be up to another billion by middle of the next decade, and dominated by growth in Asia and Africa. When we look at what those numbers mean, Manchester's last census was 2011, and Manchester's got roughly 500,000 people that live within it. So 1 billion people, that's another 10 years' time, 1 billion more people in the world. It's 2,000 cities the size of Manchester. That's how many people are going to be around more than there are today, all of whom need energy and electricity to make their lives work. And you look at a first and third world country, South Africa, where Khayelitsha, Cape Town, there's nearly 5 million people there. That's 10 times more than Manchester's people living in a shanty town that has very little in the way of modern amenities like electricity and running water. So big disparities. 1.5 billion people nearly without sufficient electricity now, and it's estimated that there's still going to be the same amount, roughly, by 2030. So interesting dilemma for us to solve. Linked with population growth, we also see energy consumption going up, because as population grows, the energy consumption globally goes up. So 30% increase by 2025 to cope with those extra billion people, and potentially a 50% increase by 2035. So although energy demand is not going up here, because we're an OECD country, it is going up in the non-OECD world. So big demand. So when we come back to what does that mean in terms of UK space and what we're doing about it, the one thing we have done is try our best to look at carbon mitigation and to encourage others to do the same. You know, to take the climate change as a fact underpinned by science, and to say we've got to do our bit to help move global thinking along. So we're after low carbon, affordable, secure and efficient both energy and electricity. And they're not always compatible objectives. You know, you can't always get them lined up, as we'll see in a minute. So we were very good as a country in putting into legislation this scientific challenge to stabilise the atmosphere by 2050. And we did it by legislating for a set of low-carbon budgets to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% compared with the 1990s by 2050. Now, the thing I've never figured about that is, what's going to happen if we don't make it? Who's going to get fined? If it's legislated for, then somebody's going to have broken the law when you don't meet it. But it's not clear to me, so what? And I'm not sure anybody else has thought that through either. But nevertheless, it's the right thing to do in terms of being globally responsible citizens. But the big problem is nobody asked the engineering community whether it was remotely feasible or not. And what I'm going to do is hopefully pose some challenges to that objective in engineering space. You know, so how we're going to do it, can it really be done? So the resources available to us, earth, air, fire, water and sun, which translate in low carbon space to nuclear, wind turbines, biomass, hydro, marine and solar. So that's what we've got available to us in terms of electricity generation is concerned. Now, if we look, I've chosen to portray this as a block diagram rather than a pie chart. And if you look at the right-hand side, that is red, nearly all red. Red is fossil fuel in the form of oil. Green is gas. Okay, so you'll see that green and red dominate this block diagram, which is our energy demand. And on the right-hand side, transport uses about 30% of that allocation. And another 30+% is used by gas, mainly domestic gas in our homes, having been a gas-absorbing nation since North Sea oil really and gas came to the fore. And the bit that people talk about most is the blue bit, which is electricity. And only part of that is low carbon. 60–70% routinely is fossil still in the form of coal and gas. So if we're going to decarbonise our lives here in the UK, we're going to have to shift the red and the green to blue, and in pretty short order. And that means that our electricity demand is going to double, if not treble, on the timescale we're talking about. So the UK is in a kind of interesting position because we're an island, not very well connected, which I'll come on to in a minute. And there's a big disparity between summer, which is the green and the red on the diagram, and winter, which is black and blue. And you sometimes are if you fall over in the snow. But if we look at the peaks, early in the morning from 5:30 through to 7:30, 8 o'clock, and in the evening in the winter from 4:30 through to 6 o'clock, there are big hikes in our demand for electricity in pretty short order. There's a 20 gigawatt hike in the morning as people get up, put the kettle on, eat the breakfast, etc., and as industry fires up for the day. And at night when we come home, with industry still ticking on, there is another 10, 15 gigawatt hike. Now, 10 gigawatts is 10 big power stations. So, you know, those peaks affect the amount of infrastructure that has to be built. And if we can flatten out those peaks somewhere, which is a challenge for the future, then maybe we can do with less. So, how many of you charged your iPads, or how many of you charge your iPads and iPhones in a morning between 5:30 and 8 o'clock, say, or at home in the evenings when it's still peak time? How many would think nothing of plugging your chargers in? Now, would you be prepared to accept an app on your iPhone or iPad, etc., that meant you couldn't do that? Because if everybody in the country couldn't do that, maybe we could look at flattening the peaks. If everybody in the country agreed to have grid controller turn their freezer off between 4 o'clock and 6:30 at night, it wouldn't make any difference at all to the performance of your freezer particularly, but it would make a big difference to the overall drawdown on demand. Hotels in London are already doing deals with London Electric to switch their air conditioning off at peak times in the afternoon in the summer when there's a big draw on demand. So if you're in a hotel in London after 4 o'clock and before 7, you might find it getting a bit sticky late afternoon. It's because the aircon's off, because they're getting a good deal with London Electric to do that, to help flatten demand. So if you look at where our electricity comes from, I picked 2010, because that's one of the coldest days that we've had for some years, and picked 6 o'clock in the evening, and our electricity was coming mainly from gas, coal, nuclear, and more nuclear from the interconnect with France, and the bulk was being made up with pump storage, oil stations brought back on that were mothballed, a limited amount of hydro, and a little bit of OCGT, and a tiny amount of wind, because there was an anticyclone sitting over us and everybody else in Europe. So it shows you what happens when it's very cold. There's an anticyclone sitting over us. No solar, obviously, because it's dark. Not a lot of wind at the time. Still very, very reliant on fossil energy, as well as nuclear power. If we look at Christmas Day this year, industry's not running, so the demand is a lot less. It was only 35 instead of 60, which was in that previous slide. And we see that, again, it's nuclear, gas and coal that are providing the bulk of our base load, with a little bit more from wind. But again, you know, we wake up, kids open presents, we cook the turkey, we watch the telly, and our base load is about 35 gigawatts on Christmas Day. So just showing you again where that comes from. Still coal, gas, nuclear providing the bulk of our power. But the coal and gas, you know, we're not doing much about reducing that in terms of carbon targets. I explained that we had a big link. We didn't have a big link, sorry, out to other places. We've still got one to Northern Ireland, with the big one to France, which is a large, two large power stations worth, and more being connected through the North Sea wind farm network out into the Netherlands and possibly out to Norway. So we need more links. We need to be connected to the European supergrid, and that requires a lot of investment that is currently not necessarily underway. So we look at what we're going to have to do to improve the domestic heat and power. That means we're going to have ground source heat pumps and air source heat pumps, and a lot more solar to help us do that. And for transport, we're going to look at electric cars, but electric trucks and other such things are a bit too far off yet in terms of the power that you require to drive them. So huge challenges to delivering the electrical infrastructure to enable us to do that. And huge challenges on our populated island to move from gas, which many people now have, to something different. It's kind of ironic that all the new buildings, all the new houses being built at the moment, many of them are still being plumbed with gas as the only source of domestic heat. And also, many new homes are smaller than the old-fashioned homes, and they don't have water storage tanks. They've got direct, gas to water boilers. So that storage that was always helpful in the past in terms of hot water is missing in a lot of our newer buildings. So going back to the challenge, Royal Academy of Engineering worked to say, well, okay, we looked at some stuff with electric vehicles, which you might find interesting. So if you Google it, then you can get access to it. But on the generating the future, we said, we won't disagree with the target. We'll say, we've got to do it. So the question was, how are we going to do it? And so we calculated with industry what you'd have to build. What's the most you could build between now and about 2030 in order to meet those 2050 targets? And this told you the amount, and it gives you an idea of some of the efficiency losses, load factor losses that you get, because you have to build, for instance, for solar at the moment, 10 times more than you actually get in order to cope with that. Now, all of these are likely to improve going forward as technology improves generally, but it meant that we're going to have to install all these things. And what did that mean? Well, that translates to 9,600 2.5 megawatt turbines onshore, more than we've got. That's like the big one up on the motorway going past Lancaster University. Another 38 London arrays. That's the big wind farm down in the South Thames Gateway. Solar, 25 million panels more than we have. Wave, 1,000 miles of Polaris. Tidal stream, at least 2,300 CGen turbines, that's 7 barrages built, and 1,000 further small hydro schemes installed. So, Polaris has struggled to success commercially, but it would mean building 3 miles a month for the next 40 years, which is like building a London tube tray's worth every day. And Polamis is struggling economically at the moment. After Christmas, it was in discussions with the bank, so whether or not that will continue as a possibility or not, we don't know. 2,500 CGen turbines, these are like the ones in Strangford Lough, very large submarine turbines. The Severn barrage, already questionable in government space as to whether they would allow it to go forward or not, although recently the tidal barrage in, can't remember if it's Swansea or Cardiff, has been given the go-ahead, which is good. More solar panels, improving all the time in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, and new materials. The onshore wind turbines and the offshore wind turbines, which present a lot of the challenges in technology space. Now, this is a calm day, obviously. How many of you are sailors? A few sailors in the audience. So you'll know that in a force 9 in the middle of October, it's not a good place to be. And so one of the biggest difficulties with the offshore wind arrays that we have are the efficiency and load factor losses because of the maintenance that is required upon them when they don't work. Now, fortunately, and gearboxes are one of the main issues with these big infrastructure projects. There are some weaknesses, not many are working as well as they should, and that's one of the target areas for improvement. So you will now see steps taken to try and look at different ways to design wind turbines for the offshore environment that will hopefully do better. And one has just started up at Hunterston in Scotland this week that is a 7 megawatt unit, which cost just short of £100 million. So they're expensive pieces of infrastructure, which is why utilities are cautious and risk-averse when it comes to going ahead with some of the things that have already been permissioned. There's a lot of engineering challenges in terms of seabed anchoring, in looking at floating devices, and in the turbine technology itself. Walney Wind Farm, for those of you who are based in the north, this is smaller than the London array, but it just gives you an idea as to how big a sea area is required to give you the equivalent of half a nuclear power station's worth, for instance, just as an example. So this is what we thought we could build. So industry agreed that this was pretty much maxed out, and when you did the calculations, you still needed 80 new big stations to cope with those increased demands as you shifted from transport and you shifted from gas in homes. So 80 new big power plants, whether they be nuclear or carbon capture on fossil, which doesn't go all the way to fully reduced carbon, as people will know. And a demand reduction of at least 30%. So a change in behavior for us to be treating energy as a precious resource rather than something that we can just waste. And so back to the jumpers in homes instead of walking around in your T-shirt all the time. So no silver bullets, demand reduction across all sectors, and a combination of increased efficiency with that behavioural change, and a full suite of technologies necessary. So now I'm just going to talk about the challenges in the nuclear bit, so that you can see that even if the way was paved and it was easy, there are still some challenges. So it's in the public eye, more so than many other technologies. If there's anything at all on it, it's usually number one on the news, whereas the other technologies don't necessarily get that level of scrutiny. There's a big difference between men and women in terms of the views about the nuclear energy. Women tend to be a lot less favourably disposed towards nuclear energy than men do. Just that's one of those things. But should the public really be concerned? And I would argue, and I'll show you some of the stuff, there are plenty of challenges. Most are associated with economic and public and social acceptability. And engineering and the science that underpins it is part, but not all of the solution. Here at home, a lot of the challenges had their origin a long time ago when we first started our nuclear power programme. So there were consequences of the UK's early development of nuclear power and its link originally with the military mission. So a lot of prototypic stuff was built. There's consequences of the choice of systems we chose, which were gas-cooled rather than water-cooled, and that's a really important one I'll come back to. And we've delayed in dealing with cleaning up the legacy from the past systems and our early choices. And for new build, one of the consequences of privatisation is that we're totally beholden to market forces, as we are with every energy source. We're also in hoc with the cost and the availability of money, and we need to reinvigorate the UK's supply chain if we're not just going to be buying stuff from overseas. So around the world, there's 435 plants going. They only provide about 14% of the world's power. So in a global sense, nuclear's contribution to carbon reduction is important, but it's not that high. There's 60 being built in 13 countries, mainly China, South Korea, Russia. 137 on order, a further 295 proposed. So more than a doubling of the current inventory proposed between now and 2050. And significant capacity increases by just getting more energy out of the ones we've got. In terms of an idea as to who's got what, we've got 18% currently. At peak in the mid-1990s, 30% of yours and my electricity came from nuclear. USA has 103 reactors, 20%. France has 58, 75. 32 Switzerland, etc., etc. Japan turned its off following Fukushima, but is slowly but surely switching them back on. Germany still generates 18% from nuclear, but is still scheduled to turn them off by 2022. And that's why I've put an X, which should have been slightly further down. China, massive program in China to uplift their nuclear contribution and every other type of energy that they've got. So, we're likely to see a 5- to 6-fold growth by 2020 and onward. Massive. China's the biggest place for new nuclear power plant. India, not far behind, with 8 under construction, another 20 planned. 100-fold growth planned between now and 2050. We had our 3 generations of power stations, our very early ones, the Magnox ones, which are responsible for a fair bit of our legacy wastes, and our advanced gas-cooled reactors before we decided to import overseas technology. Now, a lot of success with the early reactors. We were one of the first countries to get electricity out of them. Calder Hall in Cumbria, now shut after 50 years operation. These were our Magnox power stations, mainly around the coast or on Lake Trosvenith in Wales. Last ones were Oldbury in Gloucestershire and Wilfer, which is just winding down now. That's Wilfer's on Anglesey, and we sold 2, one to Italy, one to Japan. We also built fast reactors. They're a new generation of reactors that I can talk about for days, but I won't bore you with it. But we built 2 prototypes, and they're now being decommissioned in the north of Scotland at Dounreay. Then we moved on to our advanced gas-cooled reactors, and these are the ones that still provide your electricity today. Nearest one to here is probably Heysham, up in Lancashire. And then we imported the American technology to build Sizewell B. And any of the other reactors that we build will be of overseas design at the moment. So the grand challenges are keeping the ones we've got going. And one of the consequences of us choosing the gas-cooled systems back in the 1960s are that they now need replacing. Light water reactors, the sort that we will build now, everybody else chose those, and they've got a lifetime that is at least 20, 25 years longer than ours. So if we'd picked water reactors back in 1964, we wouldn't be talking about nuclear power now, because we'd still have another 20 years worth of life out of the ones we'd built. We've got to support the current reactors, get ready for the new ones, and deal with the legacy waste. So in terms of life extension, because you'd hope to be able to get something, our old reactors have got 2 problems. Degradation of the graphite core, which is also part of the structure, and degradation of the austenitic materials, that's the steels, in the boilers and generators. So in the graphite core, its core is made up of interlocking bricks into which the fuel fits, and it's a structural component, and it degrades with time during the lifetime of the operator. So they can't run beyond a certain point that's approved by the regulator. In terms of boilers, they're like spaghetti. Once they start to degrade, you can't get at them to replace them because they're in the concrete bioshield. So basically, that's why our reactors have to be turned off when they reach those points. So new build, they've been pushed out as far as they can. And we await what happens next. So consequences of the historic choices that we made. First of all, a very large bill for decommissioning and cleanup, much of it attributable to an early military mission, but also because we built every prototype known to man at the time, and we didn't think about how we were going to decommission them when we did it. We've got low public and political confidence in our ability to sort out the waste, and we're now vulnerable to market forces for building new stuff. So, range of products and waste from the previous programme. We adopted a Heinz 57 approach, one of everything. And that means that you can't standardise as much as you would like to. And the material we also designed to be stored in ponds where it degrades, and we're now looking at retrieving material from ponds that has been there for the best part of 50 years. And there's been programs over 20 years to get to the point where you can do that, and it was only last month that they started to be able to retrieve the sludge that had been generated as a result of leaving it for 50 years. So not a happy tale, I have to say. But since 1980, when the industry and the government recognised that you couldn't just leave stuff like that, everything's been designed to be treated and packaged as it has arisen. So packaged in concrete or in glass in steel containers, put in proper stillages, stored mainly at Sellafield, at Dounreay, and lower level wastes are stored at reactor sites. But one of the consequences of choosing the gas reactors is they're large. The graphite cores are large compared with the smaller, more energy intensive water reactor cores. So it means we've got a bigger problem dealing with our reactors than everybody else in the world does, because once you've emptied the fuel out of a light water reactor, it's pretty easy to decommission thereafter. So in terms of wastes from the past, it's the blue bit on the slide, and waste from replacing our existing fleet is 10%, so the orange bit on the slide. Now that translates into the stuff we've got to deal with, whether we built anything new or not, is 5 Albert Halls worth. Mainly intermediate level waste. That's the cans around the fuel, the concrete that it's come into contact with, the process plants it's come into contact with. Small amounts of uranium and plutonium that's retrieved that you can use again. Some low-level waste that can't go to the national disposal site where all the hospital waste and things like that goes, and only a tiny amount of high-level waste, only 0.1 of an Albert Hall's worth, so it would probably fit in about twice this space. Journey to a final repository. I object strongly to being called a geological repository because it implies that so much hangs on the geology. And if we get to having a debate about your geology is worse than my geology, so it's not going, so my geology is worse than your geology, so it's not going with me, it has to go with you, we've lost the plot. Because we can engineer to fit in most types of rock, if that's what we want to do. So I'd rather it was just called a well-engineered deep store. And we're still under a process to actually get there in terms of getting a community that accepts. Most of it's already at Sellafield, with smaller amounts in Scotland, where they're not going to deep dispose, they're just going to shallow dispose. Scotland's got a different policy. On the reactors themselves, as I said earlier, they're not really problematic to actually cut down. And other countries have got to storage successfully. America's got a repository that actually takes its defense waste, not its civil waste, in New Mexico. Finland, they've got a repository that they're building and will come into operation soon, very close to their Olkiluoto site, building it down underground. So these are the schematics, and this is what it looks like in terms of the silo where they're going to put their waste. In Sweden, they've again done a lot of work, gone on a long journey and got public acceptance about what should happen with their nuclear waste. This is the diagram of the repository, obviously a lot underground, but not much on top, and a test facility at Forsmark where they've been able to do an awful lot of engineering and science to underpin what they're up to, which is to put the fuel in canisters and I'll just go back one, and put them in interim storage pending the final repository. Okay, so a massive amount of science has gone on internationally, and a massive amount of engineering expertise exists to move towards an approved operating repository, but what we need now is proper engagement with everybody who's likely to live near one to try and get a contract, a compact between the nation and whoever accepts it to have it there. So last bit of the talk's just on the consequences of electricity privatisation, because it meant that government could no longer tell the utilities what to do. It paved the way for new nuclear back in the middle of the last decade. And this was the decision, 11 sites, 10 approved in the end. Dungeness was rejected because of being a site of special interest. And 2 of the original Cumbrian sites were removed, so there's only 1 now in Cumbria. So that's government policy, that's where they would go. Interestingly, these were the utilities that said that they might be thinking about investing in new nuclear. Now, all these utilities are private sector utilities with shareholders, so unless it made economic sense, they weren't going to be interested. And it would have to make economic sense because there's other easier routes for them to follow. You'll notice that we sold British Energy out to EDF to create EDF Energy now, and many of us get our electricity from them. The only British companies in play at the time were Centrica and Scottish and Southern Energy. EDF decided if they were going to build, they would build French technology from the French company Areva, who is building in Finland and France. Pressurized water reactor, works a bit like a pressure cooker. Water heats up, goes through a steam generator to the turbine. Occhiluto, not a happy story in terms of a project, but coming to fruition now. Flamanville, again, first of a kind of that type in France, so again, a lot to be learned. And it's this Flamanville reactor which will be built at Hinkley Point and at Sizewell if those projects go ahead. Hinkley Point is awaiting a final investment decision. At Wilfer, in Anglesey, RWE and E.ON, 2 German companies, formed a joint venture called Horizon. But when Fukushima hit and Germany decided to to not have nuclear power anymore, E.ON and RWE had very difficult balance sheets because of the difficulties in Germany. So they pulled back and said, we're not going to invest in nuclear stuff. So a decision in Germany affected who was going to invest here in Britain. So they sold out to GE Hitachi, Horizon Nuclear Power, and Hitachi make boiling water reactors, and so that's what's going to get built at Wilfer. So not in British control, Hitachi have decided that we're going to build boiling water reactors at Wilfer. They work more like a kettle. The water heats up as it goes past the hot fuel straight to turbine as steam. So there's no intermediate steam generator in a boiling water reactor. So they're slightly simpler to build. This is the big station in Japan, Kashiwazaki Kariwa. There's 7 of the type. So the 7 boiling water reactors. The 2 at the top, in the top left-hand corner, are the 2 are like the one that would be built here. And these are the string of reactors of the same type. So they've built them and they're operating, so they know what they're doing. The final consortia originally had Scottish and Southern in it, but they decided not to go ahead. It also had a Spanish utility, Iberdrola, and a Swedish utility, Vattenfall. But in the end, they thought the UK was not they weren't sure whether the UK was committed enough, and in the end sold out to Toshiba. The other company, Suez, is a Gaz de France Suez venture. So the reactors at Cumbria will go ahead under NewGen, which is jointly owned by Toshiba and Suez. And Toshiba own Westinghouse, and they will build Westinghouse reactors. So if you'd asked me 10 years ago, would we build reactors all of one type, I'd have said definitely, because that's the right thing to do. You get the learning, and you've just got a single fleet of one type. And now we've got 3 different sorts, but they're still all part of global fleets, so we'll benefit from having the learning from experience on the global fleet. In terms of the barriers that prevent any releases to the environment that worry people, you start with a tiny pellet that contains the fuel, into the fuel assembly on the bottom left there, into the reactor vessel itself, which is the tiny bit sitting here. So a reactor that will generate 1,600 megawatts like Hinkley Point is only 5 meters in diameter. So you could fit 2 reactors, one each behind the screens here. And each one would give you 1,600 megawatts of power. So they're incredibly energy-dense sources of electricity for us. Problems in building them is money, because Hinkley Point, each one's costing £8 billion. And nuclear technology is dominated by the cost of capital and its financing. Over 60% of what you and I pay for our nuclear electricity is the cost of financing the capital employed. So capital is a big deal in nuclear space. And for the big units, with the financial crisis, it's getting harder and harder for single company balance sheets to withstand it. So small modular reactors are now seen as very attractive. They wouldn't be attractive on a bits per megawatt basis, but because you only have to lay out a lesser amount to start with and you get your money back faster, then the financial markets may actually decide that these are a better bet. So the question for us is, would we be happy to see a series of small reactors rather than one or two big ones out into the future to help us? There are advantages as well as money. They're better from a grid standpoint. If you're switching only 100, 200 megawatts instead of 1,600, it's easier for the grid. And there's export potential in countries that don't have large grids. In terms of the benefit to the economy in the UK, there's 62,000 people working in nuclear in the UK. And we have one of the world's best regulators for regulating that industry in terms of not letting anything that is likely to concern us go through. So we have a very good approach to regulation. It's independent from government, and the regulator will just issue a shutdown notice if they are uncomfortable in any way whatsoever with the safety cases being made. We have an incredible academic base here in the UK, and we're now seeing large numbers of students from overseas coming here to study the nuclear courses, both at undergraduate level as modules and at postgraduate level. You'll notice there's a big hub here at Manchester. Manchester was one of the first universities to foresee a resurgence in nuclear energy here and internationally, and as a result has got a very large academic community here in Manchester, all the way from decommissioning and waste management through to next generation reactor systems. It also has facilities up in Cumbria to help with things like radiation science, with engineering decommissioning, and with work in the new National Nuclear Laboratory that was built up on the Sellafield site. So a good linkage between academic work and the more applied work in a national lab. And large departments here at Manchester University itself, and the Dalton Nuclear Institute located here. So having gone through all the journey about nuclear starting to be more acceptable here, the one thing that may well put a question mark over it is shale gas from the point of view of cost. And the question for us is, will the shale gas be too cheap to meter? Will it make such a difference to the economics of not just nuclear, but renewables generally, that shale gas becomes the preferred fuel of the 21st century? Now, my view is that energy is too important to omit any single technology. And it really irritates me when we get politicians saying they're going to fix the price of electricity, because that is disingenuous of them. Somehow or other, we have got to reinvest in our electricity generating network. Most of it was put in place in the 1950s when the population was 45, 50-ish million. We're now approaching 70 million people, and our infrastructure needs replacing. We don't fund the electricity network and the generating systems that provide it from general taxation. Somebody has to pay for it, and that somebody is you and I. So we've got to live with the fact that there is no such thing as cheap energy anymore. We've got to have them all. Some are more expensive than others, but it's better to have a balanced portfolio than it is to rely and put all your eggs in one basket. So I think we need all these technologies, whether they be nuclear, gas with carbon capture, coal, wind, solar, hydro, marine. And the one thing missing from there that I think we need to do a heck of a lot more about is energy storage, so that we can take better advantage of many of these technologies in terms of capturing stuff when it's generated at low demand, so that we can reduce those demand curves that I showed you earlier on. So that's my pitch for this morning. A few challenges. Nuclear, will it happen? Won't it happen? Where does it fit within our psyche in terms of low cost, efficient, low carbon? Should we really be comparing and contrasting? Either wind or nuclear? My view is it's both and. So all technologies and reducing demand. So pullovers, not t-shirts, please. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. My understanding is we could actually also make a switch towards using thorium rather than uranium or plutonium. I wonder if you could just comment on that.
You could, but thorium is not fissile on its own. It's what they call fertile. So it needs uranium-235, or it needs plutonium to start it before it becomes a self-sustaining cycle. You're quite right, and there's no reason why we couldn't, but it probably won't happen for quite a while, because the whole of the Western infrastructure, well, the whole of the global infrastructure is geared to use a uranium cycle. And so it will require the price of uranium to rise an awful lot before thorium will ever look to become economically the right way. I mean, India sits on a large amount of thorium and is the only country really looking at industrial scale deployment of thorium as the fuel. But even India is starting its raised fleet with uranium. So I think, yeah, absolutely. And when the price of uranium starts to go up and uranium looks a bit starts to look thin on the ground, we will certainly start to look at thorium.
Our current reliance on oil has obviously got huge geopolitical consequences. For instance, all of our imperialistic ventures in the Middle East. Can you see a similar situation resulting from use on uranium if we switch heavily to nuclear?
No, not really. Not in the same way, because the places that you get uranium from are mainly Canada, Australia. Yes, Kazakhstan has some large reserves, but mainly Canada and Australia. And also, you don't need very much of it to fuel some very big power stations. They only, full load in a core is only 90 tons for a full core, and you only replace a third of it once every 18 months, 2 years. So the amount of fuel that you need is not that great. So you can hold a strategic stock of some years. The fast reactor, which is a next generation type of reactor, enables you to recycle and almost self-sustain. We have enough material on our soil now from our previous campaigns to fuel a fast reactor system for thousands of years, not hundreds of years. There's enough uranium and plutonium on British soil now to run fast reactors for the foreseeable future. But they're more expensive, so that's why they're not being built.
The government have given some funding guarantees to, long-term funding guarantees to the nuclear industry in the UK, which have raised some eyebrows internationally. Have they actually got a good agreement, or have we already got a bad one? And one other thing is that you mentioned about the geology, that we could build in any geology, but weren't the places in Cumbria which were rejected on the basis of geology?
Yeah, okay. I'll take the last one first. It was felt not enough was known, but also I go back to the argument about geology being the only determinant. It shouldn't be, because we need to be satisfied. I would rather that we actually retrieve, this is a personal view, not a policy view, that you were able to retrieve the material if you wanted to. And then this idea of keeping something safe for over 1 million years, wouldn't be the final arbiter. And there's sufficient evidence to, robustly engineer a repository in geology in Cumbria, or geology in East Anglia, or other geologies. It's got to go somewhere, and if people are saying that the geology in Cumbria is not suitable, which I disagree with, by the way, it's already sitting in West Cumbria, but just not underground. Going back to the price that was agreed, the agreements are through now on that, and the question is whether or not EDF and their Chinese investors are confident enough to still proceed and give the capital. So the final investment decision is still to be made by the EDF. The agreement is what's called a strike price. It means that, and it was £93 a megawatt, it means if the price of electricity goes above that, EDF will give money back. Now what I can't remember is back to who, whether it's us as consumers or the government. But if the price of electricity is below £93 a megawatt when it generates, then the government will top it up to that amount, probably via us paying for it. And it sounds expensive, but it's not as expensive as what we're currently paying for offshore wind. So, we need to have a mature debate about how much things cost and how much we therefore have to pay. Because a lot of the electricity on the grid at the moment is there through historic investment in stations which are now, just where the costs were written off a long time ago. The new investments are going to cost whatever they are. So whether it's nuclear or offshore wind or solar, they're all expensive technologies.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I'm from Germany, so we're having this discussion obviously on a very different level.
Sure.
I'm wondering about what your thoughts are on supply stability. So we're talking a lot about renewable energies, and because they peak a lot in what they can produce. And how do you think nuclear energy fits in with generating a good baseline and being able to ramp up production quickly when you need it?
Yeah, I mean, the modern nuclear stations are better at following load than historic ones would be. But even so, they're not just switch on, switch off. You're talking about advance notice of, a need to shut down rather than an instant, not shut down, you can shut them down instantly, but you need advance notice to enable them to load follow, and it's not the most efficient way to do it. So certainly as a base load is what they're normally planned to run at. But that's why these small modular systems do have some attractions, because you can run down a small unit and the economics and the engineering feasibility of that is easier to do than for large units. Germany is easier in a way because it's connected to the central, the big European grid. We're not connected into that big European grid. So, when Germany is short of power because of no sun and low wind, then it can easily switch and import energy from the rest of Europe. And likewise, when Germany is producing a lot of wind and a lot of solar energy, then that can be shipped out to other parts in Europe, and they can wind down some of their other technologies. So if you're in a big grid, it gives you a lot more flexibility, and we're not.
This will be the final question, so sorry about that, everybody.
You can grab me over lunch if you still want to ask me questions.
It seems that nuclear power is safe as long as you run it properly. I'm from Ireland, which does not have a history of regulation. How would you see nuclear being used there, considering it seems inevitable we need it for power and energy security?
Well, again, Ireland would probably be attractive for the smaller modular units, just because of the overall energy demand in Ireland and the grid infrastructure. A large station like Hinkley Point, it would be more difficult to see how that would actually be utilised in Ireland. So the smaller units that are now proposed of 150, 200 megawatts, or there are currently designs at only 50 megawatts, it may well be that type is more amenable to deployment in Ireland than a large one would be. And they're similar types, still light water reactors, so have many of the design features of passive safety and control systems, the same as you get with the big ones.
Well, it's great to listen to a speaker with such expert knowledge. Please put your hands together for Sue Ion!
Thank you.